And second, we'll hear from Sarah Guindani, who is Director of Philosophy and an expert in aesthetics. She devised and leads the Politics of Images program at the FMSH in Paris and lectures in art theory at Paris 8 Saint-Denis University. Her research relates to the arts, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, notably on the relationship between image and writing in the rememoration process. She has applied this area of expertise to the works of Marcel Proust and his influence on contemporary philosophical thought, Merleau-Ponty, Deleuze, Barthes. Her publications include Lo stereoscopio de Proust, Pittura, Fotografia e Fantasmagoria nella ricerca, Proust's Stereoscope, Images, Photography, and Phantasmagoria in Research, and has directed several works on the relationship between literature and photography, among which Effetti de Verita, Documenti e Immagini tra storia e difensioni, Effects of Truth, Documents and Images Between History and Fiction, and I apologize for my pronunciation. She's translated from French into Italian several philosophy and art theory essays, and we're very happy to have her here with us today. She's also the scientific deputy director at the Collège d'Études Mondiales at the Foundation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. So welcome. We will begin with Wendy, and there you go.
I can start. Okay, thank you, Rebecca, for the presentation. Thank you, Adi, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here today and to share with you this moment. Louder, okay. Okay. So my concept is transparency, and the first part. I would need the PowerPoint. I don't know if I can have it. Okay, here for text and images. So my concept is transparency. And the first part could be entitled More Transparency. It's a little bit provoking, but you will see. So the current political and social discourse, thank you. Okay, so the current political and social discourse seems to be all about more transparency. The latest French political elections have gone against all expectations due to the discreditation of the initially favored candidate and his lack of transparency. We have here an image of a picture of François Fillon. Transparency is also the focus of a small social revolution that is going on in Europe in the wake of the Weinstein case. That is, the revelation of the violence and abuse undergone by many women in the workplace. The unspeakable suddenly comes to light, often thanks to the transparency offered by technology. I shall come back to this important point. The problem is not that this praise of transparency has meant that we have now Emmanuel Macron rather than François Fillon, even though I see that some of you might disagree, or that because of it, some people have been condemned. What I want to do today is, first of all, to analyze some philosophical aspects of the notion of transparency. Second, to see how they apply in contemporary political philosophy. And finally, use these tools to analyze a concrete case study related to the Trump administration. So, for the philosophical. Transparency is a leitmotif that runs through the whole of Western philosophy. Before becoming a metaphor, transparency was a concept related to the optical field. As noted by Emmanuel Aloa, transparentia in Latin is the Latin translation of the Greek diaphanes and refers to the aesthetic quality of a material that transmits light without deviating it. Then the notion of transparency gradually filtered into the domain of epistemology, where, in analogy with light, it may sometimes indicate the intuition of the mental gaze or the self-evident nature of certain truth. One could say transparency is the engine of philosophy itself, considering the latter's yearning for an idea that transcends sensible contingency. Here we are for the political concept. The concept is in the Socratian tradition, something that allows us to go au-delà, beyond the sensible existence. The sensible medium should dissolve, becoming transparent, and leave room for an idea. The more the medium is dematerialized and matter is spiritualized, the closer we get to the truth. In short, the truth is reached when the sensible loses its opacity and resistance and acquires transparency. This is Jacques Derrida's diagnosis of metaphysics and its tendency toward logocentrism. We can discuss it, maybe it's later with Lauro Dello, that is a great specialist of Derrida. Writing has been devaluated as opposed to orality, just like the body and matter have been devaluated as opposed to an immaterial principle, be it the soul or the idea. Transparency brings other associated terms with it: spirit, truth. The semantic network of this term shows that it does not simply indicate the quality of visibility, but also has significant moral connotations. In the European tradition, transparency alludes to the phantom of a pure presence, which can only appear by dissolving its material medium. The Greek notion of aletheia, meaning truth as unveiling, is strongly linked to that of transparency. The notion of transparency thought is also related to two other terms that define its moral and temporal implication: innocence and immediacy. Jean Starobinski, in La transparence et l'obstacle, the transparency and the obstacle, speaks about the dream of transparency made real by the technique of vitrification. I quote, the technique of vitrification is inseparable from a dream of innocence and substantial immortality. Transforming a corpse into translucent glass is a victory over death and over the decomposition of bodies. It is already a step toward eternal life. Another important term to understand the notion of transparency is pure visibility, namely the idea that what is transparent places no filters, no barrier to the gaze. The inside is never visually separated from the outside, and the two spaces are entirely visually permeable. We saw it in the previous talk. In this sense, transparency has significant political weight as it plays a role in defining the inside and the outside, the public and the private of social life. Plato already expressed worry about the fact that citizens should hide aspects of their lives. In Laws, when discussing what makes a good administration of the city, Plato makes the Athenian say. It's a long passage, so I prefer to put it on the PowerPoint. As to the walls, Megillos, I agreed with Sparta in thinking that they should be allowed to sleep in the earth and that we should not attempt to disinter them. There is a poetical saying, which is finally expressed, that walls ought to be of steel and iron, meaning the war is the real wall, and not of earth. Besides, how ridiculous of us to be sending out our young men annually into the country to dig and to trench and to keep off the enemy by fortifications under the idea that they are not to be allowed to set foot in our territory, and then that we should surround ourselves with a wall, which, in the first place, is by no means conducive to the health of cities and is also apt to produce a certain effeminacy in the minds of the inhabitant, inviting men to run thither instead of repelling their enemies and leading them to imagine that their safety is due not to their keeping guard day and night, but that when they are protected by walls and gates, then they may sleep in safety. As if they were not meant to labor and did not know that true repose comes from labor and that disgraceful indolence and a careless temper of mind is only the renewal of trouble. So, transparency is the social space in the social space is good if not necessary for the morality of citizens. Walls weaken their spirit, make them lose their fighting spirit and resourcefulness. Transparency is therefore crucial to the constitution of the polis and is therefore central to the virtue of a good citizen. In the specter of dematerialization, if the specter of dematerialization is ancient, the possibility of its realization is a specific attribute of modernity. The dematerialization process of our cities and our daily life is to be read in parallel with the advent of electricity and telecommunication. Electricity marks the end of the idea of reality as a continuum of solid and compact bodies, while at the same time generating the aesthetic and political dream of the penetrability of matter, if not of its complete dissolution into pure energy. The modern world has always broken to bodies and minds, using technology to go as deep as possible into the cosmos and into matter, into the human body and its psyche. The prophetic list McLuhan made in 1964 seems to make it clear that technology aims precisely at this dematerialization and openness. The telephone, speech without walls. The phonograph, music hall without walls. The photograph, museum without walls. The electricity light, space without walls. The movie, radio, and TV, classroom without walls. At a socio-political level, this dematerialization translates into the crisis of enclosure institution, milieu d'enfermement, as Foucault said. Gilles Deleuze talks about this in his postscript on the society of control in 1990. I quote, "We are in a generalized crisis in relation to all environments of enclosure, prison, hospital, factory, school, family. Everyone knows that these institutions are finished, whatever the length of their expiration period." He talks about new forces knocking at the door. These are the societies of control, which are in the process of replacing the disciplinary societies. But what is a society of control? Deleuze defines it as a very fast mode of control that no longer takes place by means of enclosure, but through constant control and instant communication. In 1990, at the dawn of the digital age, when people still did not imagine how ubiquitous the web would become, Deleuze managed to grasp how it would transform individuals and institutions. He makes the example of hospitals, with the increasing cases of day hospital intervention and home health care, which he sees as a sign of a potential ambivalence of freedom and control. In addition to remarking the metamorphosis of space, Deleuze notes that the society of control also changes time. I quote, "In the disciplinary societies, one was always starting again from school to the barracks, from the barracks to the factory, while in the societies of control, one is never finished with anything." And we know this phenomenon with the email system. The temporality of this new regime is that of urgence and immediacy, in both senses of the term. The lack of a medium implies an acceleration. This phenomenon was first mentioned by Paul Virilio, that is mentioned by Deleuze, but recently by the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, who analyzed the relationship between acceleration and alienation, and by the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, who has investigated the madness of disruption. With a tremendous imagination, also in the ethical sense of term noted by Hannah Arendt, Gilles Deleuze has succeeded in interpreting the symptoms of his society so as to envision the possible evils of a society to come. I quote, "In the prison system, the attempt to find penalties of substitution, at least for petty crimes, and the use of electronic collars that force the convicted person to stay at home during certain hours. For the school system, continuous form of control and the effect of the school of perpetual training, the corresponding abandonment of all university research, the introduction of the corporation at all levels of schooling. For the hospital system, the new medicine without doctor or patient that singles out potential sick people and subject at risk, the topic of predictability, which is no ways attested to individuation, as they say, but substitutes for the individual or numerical body the code of a individual material to be controlled. In the corporate system, new ways of handling money, profits, and human that no longer pass through the old factory form. These are very small examples, but ones that will allow for better understanding of what is meant by the crisis of the institution, which is to say, the progressive and dispersed installation of a new system of domination. No, here we are. Indeed, for Deleuze, power is mainly a form of visibility, a view shared by Foucault, who in Surveiller et Punir, Discipline and Punish, argues that the stability and legitimacy of political power rely on a model of vision. This model, for Foucault, is the Panopticon. And what is the Panopticon? Is a transparent and circular prison imagined by philosopher Jeremy Bentham in late 18th century. In it, the institution's representative, the guardian, housed in a central tower, has an absolute scopic power that allows him to observe all the prisoners without them knowing if they are being watched. Seeing without being seen is the abstract formula of the Panopticon. Being seen without seeing, instead, is the formula from the point of view of the dominated. The Panopticon is the model that reflects but also overcomes the disciplinary society. In fact, it replaces a much more concrete surveillance system based on quarantines and enclosures, supervisors, and control. With the Panopticon, one supervisor is enough, as all information is available to him through the visual device. Foucault writes, full lighting and eye of a supervisor capture better than darkness, which ultimately protected. Visibility is a trap. Hence, the most important function of the Panopticon, I quote, to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. The Panopticon is a machine for dissociating the being seen dyad. In the peripheric ring, one is total and seen, without ever seeing. In the central tower, one sees everything without ever being seen. It is a device aimed at improving the exercise of power by making it faster, lighter, more effective. If then the society of enclosure has a vision model that anticipates the society of controls, the latter has surviving elements of the former. But Deleuze was already very lucid on this point. I quote, "It might be that older methods borrowed from the former society of sovereignty will return to the fore, but with the necessary modification." And this is what, after this long conceptual premise, brings me to the point that has brought us together today. So my second part is from more transparency to more Trump-parency. So I present you this new concept, the concept of Trump-parency. So how to explain Donald Trump's obsession with the wall between the United States and Mexico? How to interpret this will to close space when the open, transparent, and fluid society of global control has come to its peak? In an interview with the New York Times on July 13th, Donald Trump made remarkable and significant statements about the construction of this wall, which I am here taking as a symbolic and symptomatic figure of his exercise of power. When the journalist asked him whether he was joking about building a solar wall, the President of the United States said, "No, not joking, no. There is a chance that we can do a solar wall. We have major companies looking at that. Look, there's no better place for solar than Mexico border, the southern border. And there is a very good chance we can do a solar wall, which would actually look good. But there is a very good chance we could do a solar wall. But the most interesting thing is that this wall should have particular visual qualities." Trump, in fact, continued as follows. One of the things with the wall is you need transparency. You have to be able to see through it. In other words, if you can't see through the wall, so it could be a steel wall with openings, but you have to have openings because you have to see what's on the other side of the wall. So, to explain the reason for this transparency, Trump has used moral and legal reasons. No, sorry, it was a... Oh. But have you seen the previous? Yeah. Okay. I can read. I think that is not so important. It was. I can. I can't go on without the PowerPoint otherwise. Just 2 seconds. Okay. Okay, perfect. So, to explain the reason for this transparency, Trump has used moral and legal reasons. And I'll give you an example. As horrible as it sounds, when they throw the large sacks of drugs over, and if you have people on the other side of the wall, you don't see them. They hit you on the head with 60 pounds of stuff. It's over. As crazy as the sounds, you need transparency through the wall. But we have some incredible designs. So why should transparency deter those who throw sacks of drugs over the wall? The transparency invoked here seems to imply the self-regulatory functioning Foucault said would operate through the Panopticon, that is, the ability to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. This is a paradigmatic example of the paradoxical nature of Trump's power. The manifest discourse is that of a reactionary, closed, nationalist, and xenophobic society, implying enclosures and the multiplications of barriers. However, this proclamation clashes against the reality of the society of control. The wall separates and hides, whereas the new barriers are dematerialized and light. They look more like the electronic gates at the airport or station, but now also museums, schools, and after recent terrorist revival. The new barriers are light, penetrable, transparent, mobile, and are everywhere. And they also have the ability to extract information about us, to intrude into us, up to making us transparent. This is Foucault's intuition come true. Full light shows more than the shade. Visibility is a trap. Trump's call to make the wall between the United States and Mexico transparent seems to me as a sort of symptom or latent meaning in his own political discourse. This image claims to fall under the interest of global system, despite its protectionist and national facade. Transparency is used here as the main instrument of control of the globalized world, where what is transparent is only such from a certain position of power. Indeed, transparency has never been simply given. We saw the link between authenticity and artificial is the same thing for transparency. Transparency is manufactured. And what is interesting is that this manufacturing technique are then denied and made invisible. This is the kind of power that in Mémoire d'aveugle, Memoir of the Blind, Jacques Derrida attributes to the lenses. They allow us to see only insofar as they are themselves unseen. Now, in his wish to build a transparent wall, Trump is enacting the manufactured transparency of the Panopticon. However, one should note that this transparency is only possible if there is a punctum cecum, a blind point, lying outside this transparency. The formula of Panopticon is seeing without being seen, after all. The position of the Trump administration should be read in the light of this paranoid visibility. Even in the campaign, the transparency invoked for others implied significant opacity when it came to the means to obtain it. I am thinking, of course, of the emails stolen from the Democratic Party during Hillary Clinton's campaign and published by WikiLeaks in the name of transparency, whereas the means to obtain such emails have not been subject to the same requirements. Not to mention the links with Putin's criminal politics, the paradox of an alliance with Julian Assange, who is officially under an international arrest warrant, and an organization like WikiLeaks that is officially regarded as sort of terrorist or not legal association. In short, the mechanism of transparency seems to work only if all the conditions that determine it are invisible. I wish to conclude with a passage in which Jacques Derrida, talking about his own philosophical writing, warns us about an acritical call for transparency. I quote, "My own experience of writing leads me to think that one does not always write with the desire to be understood, that there is a paradoxical desire not to be understood. It's not simple, but there is a certain, I hope, that not everyone understands everything about this text. Because if such a transparency of intelligibility were ensured, it would destroy the text. It would show that the text has no future, avenir, an important concept for Derrida, that it does not overflow the present, that it is consumed immediately. This desire for non-transparency, as Derrida clearly says, responding to Searle's criticism, is not a lack of clarity, but a need of excess, a desire to live a kind of openness which leaves room to the future. For Derrida, going against transparency means leaving space in the text for what has not yet happened, for those who have not yet come, for those who will arrive, for the other as someone that cannot be expected. Derrida's thought and work, his reflections on transparency and secret, warn us against considering accessible document as straightforward and transparent. The presupposition of such transparency, as Derrida suggests, would mean the very destruction of the given text or document, the annihilation of its potential to have a future, avenir, outside of immediate consumption. Every document must be respected in its ability to be read and interpreted differently, in its ability to give space to the other witness, to the witness of the other order, in its unpredictability, and in its being the bearer of a secret to come. Thank you.
Okay, can we move this? Is it okay? Yes. Thank you so much for those excellent papers. We will begin with questions. I already see several. I've heard from the boss that we can go ahead for a few more minutes than's on the list. So we will start. We'll have Claire, Nick, Brian, and a question over here and over here. Okay, Claire.
Thank you for So thank you so much for such great papers, and they speak to each other in such a great way. So I wanted to ask a pretty broad question that that seemed to me to be one of the links between the two. Sarah, you mentioned paranoid visibility at one point, and I was wondering if Wendy could tell us about how paranoia might relate to authenticity. And I was thinking actually before you mentioned the emails, Sarah, of this horrible example of the ways in which Trumpites at one point in the after the WikiLeaks publication of the Clinton emails, how Trumpites had this delirious, paranoid moment of imagining, that pizza meant little boy and little girl, the whole Pizzagate pedophilia thing, which to me seemed like to be symptomatic of the way in which a digital search, if you search for keywords, if you have this kind of simplistic search image, then you can nourish any paranoia. It actually mimics the digital form here mimics the structure of paranoia, it seems. So I wonder how that relates to both authenticity and transparency, this question of paranoia.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, I think there is an important link with paranoia, because finally the paranoid person is the purest and the more authentic person, because he's really hunted with these two concepts, because the mechanism, psychological mechanism who operates in paranoia is projection. So the subject is pure, feels pure, and all the evil, all the negative things are projected au-delà, beyond. There is a problem with this term. And this is the reason I took the wall, because it's really a sort of a concretization of this paranoid mechanism. So just through beyond the wall, all the evil, and we stay in a sort of authenticity and pureness, and everything is beyond. So yes, I think that the paranoia, it could be a psychoanalytical or psychological concept that could work for the actual situation, the present situation.
So my first book was all about paranoia in digital media, and looked at the figure of Schreber as prefiguring networks in interesting ways. So I won't talk too much about that, but there is that move that Trilling makes to argue that authenticity has now become conflated with madness, and that there's a way in which those two logics are necessary. How do you prove you're authentic? By being even more mad. But I think that what's key for me in thinking through these models, and I'm so glad you ended the way you did, because I was exactly going to end that way, which is the question of the future. The part of the problem with these models is that if the future is determined in the same way as the past, right? If they're structurally speaking the same thing, there's a certain closure of the future. And why these models are important and why we need to engage them is because we can use them as critical tools. So just as global climate change models show us a plausible future based on our past actions, which we then can react against to open an implausible future, I think we can take the sort of racist predictions that come from a lot of these models as indicating racist patterns in the past and the present, and ways that we need to react against them so the plausible future doesn't become the future. And here I think that that question of closure and openness is absolutely key.
Nick? Okay.
So I'll keep this brief because I know there's a lot of questions to come. but I wanted to ask both of you in some way to address something which we've not really yet brought up, which is the way in which the two of these papers both sort of speak to heteronormativities and the way that they've actually become part of digital and physical structures. So I mean, this point became very clear in your presentation, Wendy, where you were talking about the question of the be true to others is to be true to self. It seems like it embodies a heteronormative logic there. And that would perhaps explain some of the ways in which so much of the hostility to drag, to trans, and so on is structural to the new form of authoritarian nationalism that we have. And in Sarah's presentation, you kind of open up a kind of tension there, because if a wall is effeminate, but it's also weak not to have a wall, then you have this kind of foundational paradox around heteronormativity, which can't sustain itself. It cannot find its own logic because in that moment. So I wondered if just to sort of, I mean, not speak at length, to ask you to think about the way that the heteronormative structures these things.
Sure. Do you want to? Okay. That's a great question. And what so when thinking about network structures, what's fascinating to me is that the basis of network science is homophily. The basic presumption is similarity breeds connection. And this is at the basic of all predictions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's interesting is that in this logic, heterosexuality is reverse homophily. And there's a bizarre way in which this also calls, so one thing that I've been calling for is queering homophily, because it's actually a very unqueer concept. And so how can we think through that? And I think that's absolutely key to think through those modes. In the last book, I also talked about the epistemology of outing, and the ways in which the logic of outing has become embedded in the ways in which these networks are conceived of in terms of public and private. And so I think that the questions of heteronormativity, queering, as well as modes of exposure and knowledge are absolutely key.
Yes, on the wall, yes, it's true that as we saw in Plato, so there is a moral connotation if we build a wall. So maybe this protection makes citizen weaker and immoral, but it's true, and without the wall is not better, because now walls are everywhere. So, but what is my point was, why a wall now? What is trying to do with this political and symbolical figure? Because now in the last century, walls fall down. So is a quite paradoxical figure, this figure of wall. So I think that is a sort of symbolical object around what we can, you know, really like a symptom, you know, a sort of lapsus or something like that, an inconscient production of his politics. Right?
Yeah, here we go. Thanks for two really great papers. I came in late, Wendy, but I really enjoyed it. My first question is really a comment to you. That image of Trump landing in the helicopter, I'm not doubting the question of authenticity, but there's a longer genealogy that really captures the caudillo and the notion that, you know, the great leader, whether he be Trujillo or Somoza, or from Jamaica, Bustamante. These people arrive in a Cadillac. They are not authentic. They are unique. I imagine authenticity can be used in that way as well. But it's a way in which you overawe your supporters. You don't appear as one of them. You appear as apart from them. And so that genealogy, I think, has to be brought into the picture as well, in terms of the question. And it also happens in a context where your supporters are disempowered. And so their disempowerment is captured in your superior power that is then able to look down from above and help them. So I just think it needs to be tweaked in that way. My second question is really stimulated by the question Tony Bogues put on the table last night about disobedience. And I think it was Nick who, I don't know where Nick has gone, who asked what is to be done? All right, and it really wasn't answered because, of course, there's no single answer as to what is to be done. But it struck me that if you think about the panopticonization of the world, which is really what Cambridge Analytica is about, which is really the point Sarah was making in her entire presentation. What is to be done? You go into the Boston Common, and 10,000 people gather, 100,000 people gather, and you leave and you feel good about it, but nothing is done. But in a world in which the real conversations are taking place through Twitter, right? Then some employee at Twitter disconnects Donald Trump for 5 minutes, and this is a huge development. But are there collective strategies? So the question really is posed is that we've had a really clear analysis of how we're being watched and how we're being analyzed. What are the strategies of disobedience that accompany this new technology and this new world?
Thanks for those questions. First of all, I think that what's important about authenticity is that it's linked to the heroic, that it's not outside of the notion of the hero. And what's important is the hero embodies leadership, right? He's not, as the Trilling quote argues, that he is that figure, right? The hero that, and it's through him and transparent within him. So I think that the question to the leader is actually crucial and embodied within the notion of the tragic hero as the authentic. In terms of the question of what is to be done, there's a ton to be done. And I think one thing we need to do is really engage with data science and networks. There is no reason why homophily should be the default assumption for network science. Because not only does it build segregation, it actually ignores most of the world, right? So again, heterosexuality becomes an abnormal thing within these networks, which is the most bizarre thing. Like, how could it? Elizabeth, are you?
No, I see. Thank you. I'll take your question later. Sorry, are you indicating something? Okay.
There's like all sorts of, it's like hand signs.
Okay, thank you. I'm all set. Continue.
Don't be a disobedient moderator. Yeah. So I think that one thing we need to do is engage data science. There are other forms of connection that need to be made. The opposites attract is a fundamental of electromagnetism, but more importantly, mutual indifference. What if mutual indifference became the basis under which clusters were made? This is how cities run. We're all mutually indifferent to certain things, right? Rather than putting us within these categories based on intense likes and dislikes. Also viewing these models as, again, critical tools for which we can diagnose what's wrong with our society. Now that's one realm of what we can do with an engagement with data science, right? Rather than laughing at it, to ask, what is it that this produces? I think that the question of collective action is absolutely key. And in order to think through the productivity of collective action, we also have to realize the ways in which deviation is now part of the ways in which we're predicted. So the mode to think out of the box, to do something slightly off, to disobey certain moral rules, is actually the basis under which we are predicted. And so under this circumstance, the question becomes, what does it mean to militate and to do something different? And here, I think what we need to think about is the habitual. Milton Friedman has this great quotation in which he says, basically, crises will always happen in a neoliberal society. The question isn't how to create crises, but how do you place the seeds of an alternative future so that when a crisis happens, what seems impossible becomes plausible. And that's where I think we need to move, because crises will happen and they happen all the time. The question is how, through the habitual, through the defaults, can we put in place the seeds of a different future, and to understand the ways in which the future can't be reduced to the past.
John?
Thank you for two. Thank you for two fantastic papers. My question is a fairly simple one, for Wendy. I noticed that that apart from sort of psychological and affective categorization, the other thing you mentioned, and the only thing you mentioned, was neighborhood. And I just was curious about the status of that, like whose neighborhoods are these? How do they relate to things like categorization generally, groupings, and collectivities? So is the neighborhood a place where we can intervene?
Absolutely. I think we need to desegregate neighborhoods within network science. So the way network science operates is that you're put into a network neighborhood based on your intense likes and dislikes. And so the fundamental assumption is segregation. Now, what's interesting is that this notion of homophily actually comes from studies of segregation within the US. It comes from Lazarsfeld and Merton's analysis of neighborhood segregation. Now, what's important is Lazarsfeld and Merton argue that homophily is just one mode. They also coined the term heterophily. And they ask, under what circumstances does homophily happen, and under what circumstances does heterophily happen? Now, this is the most cited article in network science around the question of homophily, and it completely erases the other half of the argument and takes as natural segregation. And the other example that's given as evidence of the naturalness of segregation is actually urban segregation. So they'll say, look, what is evidence that love of the same is the basis? The way in which the US is already segregated. Now, homophily, which is love of the same, okay, is only shown when you flee when other people show up, right? So it rewrites hate as love. And what it also does is it takes away institutional responsibility, because it's based on this notion that people voluntarily, of course, do X, Y, and Z. And it also refers to Schelling's work. And Schelling, in particular, and Easley and Kleinberg have a great reconstruction of Schelling's work. And the argument there is that from a random start, it's really hard to create a desegregated neighborhood on the basis of people wanting to be with people like them, but willing to be in the minority. And there's a ton to speak about this, but one thing that we need to question immediately, especially within the US, is that there is never an innocent random start when we're talking about neighborhoods. But I do think that, and this is where I think the move to neighborhoods could be interesting, because desegregation has been important. We don't all live in these segregated neighborhoods. But if we live in a world in which your neighbor equals yourself, right, then the ethical question, who is your neighbor and how do I love my neighbor, becomes narcissism, you love yourself, right? ethics becomes narcissism, and society is, yeah. So, yeah.
Yes. I had a question for both Wendy and Sarah, and thank you for both your papers. They made me think of the role that opinion polls play in this whole history. So opinion polls, they are one of the instruments of controlled societies, but also maybe already of disciplinary societies. Actually, I'm not sure, maybe they sort of overlap and they make the distinction that Deleuze suggests not so clear-cut. But clearly, opinion polls are crucial to what you so interestingly called Trumparency. Right? And also opinion polls, they furnish, they provide the data for the algorithmic transparency. Actually, I've been fascinated by the history of opinion polls for a long time, and especially by this book by the, not the inventor, but the one who configured the modern opinion poll, George Gallup, in a 1940 book called The Pulse of Democracy, which is really a very interesting title. So my question was, what do you think of Trump's relationship to opinion polls? Because very famously, when he was elected, it was unpredictable, and many polls gave him as losing, right? And on the other hand, his very claim to authenticity or transparency, if it is his claim, I don't know, but it has to do something with the fact of being not so much the object of opinion polls, but almost the very subject, as if he were the pulse of, of what is going on. So, and it's an erratic pulse, because every day it is jumping, so it's, what do you think of that? I mean, he's not so much the object of polls than he, as if he had himself the very structure of opinion polls.
Can I say just one sentence? He seems really obsessed with ratings rather than polls, and I just wanted to mention that it seems to be a media difference of some sort, and just to add to that.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that what's key to think through this question of his relationship to something like a poll or a rating is also the work that polls do. So they claim, of course, to be objective, but they're not. They also create the reality that they point to. And so trying to think through the relationship of the poll in a more performative way for Trump, I think, is absolutely key. And I think it's fascinating to think of him as the subject rather than the object, because it brings out the ways in which he's using and creating this. But I also think that this question also brings up a larger issue, which is the ways in which networks create what they allege only to be describing. Like polls allege only to be describing something, but they also create a certain political reality. And here I would point to something like police analytics, right? So the Chicago police came up with a heat list of the 400 most likely people to murder or be murdered. And they came up with this list not based on simply someone's actions, but their friends. And so then they visited the 10 most people most likely to murder or be murdered, and told them to change their ways, right? So this is like person of interest, right? So they watched a lot of TV and they thought, this could work, right? But what happened is that the homicide rate didn't go down, but those people who were identified were 2.88 more times likely to be arrested. And what it also did was cause one person who was identified argued that this put his life at danger because he had a relatively clean rap list. Cops visit, his neighbors think he's a snitch, right? So there's a weird way in which these things enact what they put in place. And if you think about the way recommender systems work, they know this, right? So you're most likely to click on the thing that's first or last. There's a whole psychology about the interface and how things are presented, which are outside of data analytics. And so I think that thinking through that performative nature and the ways they create reality is a fantastic way to start that question. They say. So, you want to be on the heat list, Elizabeth? You're on a different heat list, yeah.
No, I can't because I don't know so deeply the Trumpian system. So I think that Wendy has already said interesting thing. But one concept maybe that we can use or just put on the table to work on, that it relates also to Nick question, but also to Peter question, is I think the lack of trust. Because you said that the Trump election was a sort of unpredictable. It counts. So it's quite interesting. Even if we can ask if it was really unpredictable, as Derrida and Habermas for the 9/11. Was it an event, a real event, or something was already prepared for that? But I think that the question of trust, even, we can't trust the prediction, we can't trust even the question of wall is a question of trust. We need control, perpetual control. And what is trust? We presuppose that something is bad, so there is something to protect. There is something that is evil, that is negative, and so is, of course, the relationship with the otherness that is, but also for more epistemological and political things, I think that is the trust could be a concept that we can study, we can analyze, because there is a lack of trust. It is now just maybe an economical term. Is not something that is at the center of our co-living system. So I think that it could be something that we can analyze together.
This question is for Wendy, and it's really 2 points of clarification. The way you ended your talk was by the turn to, okay, so there's 2 parts. One is it's about the historicity of the categories that you're laying out. And the second part is how far the end of your argument applied to Trump, because you began with Trump, but did you get away from it too much? These are the questions. So about the historicity of it, you ended by talking about we could move from tragedy to comedy. And my question is really just about Trilling, which is, doesn't Trilling say, doesn't he go back to Wilde? And don't we already know from Oscar Wilde, sorry, not the later concept, Wilde, but don't we already know from Oscar Wilde that authenticity is artificial? I mean, isn't that at the very stirrings of modern authenticity, we have his sense of that? And isn't he also a writer of comedies? So how far back can we push this distinction? And I'll go further and say, or I'll ask, in Stanley Fish's book last year, there was like a airport book, Winning Arguments, how they work in the bedroom, the classroom, the courtroom. He has a reading of Trump, and he says Trump is most like Montaigne and also Mark Antony. And so, you could make a comparison. He makes a comparison between the Ciceronian speech of Hillary, I guess, and the Mark Antonian speech of Trump. So you could historicize this much further back, or he does, whether we buy that or not. And then the second question is, when you get to branded or algorithmic authenticity and the sad, pathetic, floating, happy face balloons in the office building and Google, that to me isn't Trump. I mean, that doesn't ring true with his kind of authenticity. So I would grant this is our modern subjectivity, this branded algorithmic authenticity. But then Trump surely stands out from that so that everyone can say, ah, he's different from our pathetic lives of, yeah, being predictable. He's not. In some genuine way, he's different. I mean, sorry, I don't want to overload the terms. He is markedly different from how we are as that thing. And I'll just add a question mark at the end of that.
So that's the point of being a training algorithm for training. So that's exactly the point, right? And the way the training algorithm works is by going out, right? And seeing what operates outside these modes, and then becoming the mode for training. So that's why I was thinking of him as a training algorithm for training. And I think that the question of the relationship between authenticity and artificiality, yes, of course, it has. The point is that it's always been artificial, but starting, if we keep talking about that, then we actually miss the point, which is, how is it artificial? How is it being, and trying to think through that relationship.
Leela?
So, quick question for each of the speakers. Sarah, I wonder if one...
Sorry, that was Leela.
Oh, no.
You know what we might do? What we might do, since we have 7 minutes, is we'll take 3 questions. Okay. So, I'm sorry. I said I do have 2. I apologize. Leela, Joan, Nikhil, we'll take your 3 questions. Okay, Leela.
Quite honored. Okay, well, very quickly, then, both of you gave us a dystopic reading of becoming visible, and as a symptom of moments of political crisis. I had a sort of question that I want to loop back in 2 ways to ask what you make of another, actually positive account of visibility and appearance in the long political ontological tradition. I'm thinking of Heidegger to Arendt, and I think they're kind of a slightly opportunistic reading of the daimon, where in fact you become you've become yourself in shared or public or common life when you appear or are visible. So there's that. And against that, of course, is another dissident account, actually in a transnational tradition, where there is a kind of complicated sort of something, I don't know what to call it, dissidence, against this model of the political, which consists precisely in hiding yourself. And here your Derridean example was very useful, Sarah, but in this tradition to hide yourself precisely from common or public life. I'm thinking here, in fact, number 1 of Socrates' daimon in the Apology, which he hides, and only he can hear, and it allows him to be a dissident. But I'm thinking also of Gandhi, who in fact translated Plato's Apology in 1908, and it was banned by the imperial government. And he has a kind of Socratic reflux, when he's writing his own autobiography called My Experiments with Truth, where he says he starts his career as an exhibitionist. I'm showing everything, I'm becoming myself in common or shared or public life. But, he says, in this kind of daimonic reflux, I'm keeping something, the most important part of me, hidden. And that, in his words, is clearly incommunicable. So these are just thoughts to pass a kind of knotted history of the political, apropos the question of visibility and appearance that you've touched upon, sir.
Joan was next, and then Akil. He's not going to do it again. So mine are just two short questions, one for Wendy and one for Sarah. Sarah, just on the question of transparency, what is the relationship of it to lies? Lying, mentir, to the question of the acceptance, the circulation, the possibility, whatever, of lies. And it seems to me there's some connection to issues of transparency and to lying. And I just wonder if you could think about that. And Wendy, on the question of authenticity, I think, going back to Brian's point, it's not just heroic charisma that's going on. It's not just the separation of the guy from all the rest of us. It's our, or some people's, identification with him. And the identification is based on recognizing in him certain aspects that are just like us. He screws up sometimes. He does idiotic things. He's not always coherent. I mean, yeah, we know we've been like that. He has these bad thoughts that we've had and we haven't expressed. And it seems to me that there, the authenticity comes from a form of identification rather than the revered heroic martyr. And Akil. Leela.
No response?
Your turn, Akil.
Actually, Leela asked a deeper version of the question I was going to ask you, Sarah, so I'll wait for you to wait to hear what you have to say to her question. Wendy, I was just wondering, you know, you focused on Trump and contemporary politics and spoke of forms of authenticity which can be the outcome of training and branding and algorithms. But one of the things of the last few decades in American politics, and Trump is just a late figure in this, is the hatred in the heartland, in the constituencies of conservative politics of the last few decades, the hatred of coastal metropolitan elites. It's, you know, very much part of our political culture, that hatred. And I'm wondering how much of that is just a product of settler colonialism here, in which authenticity of wealth initially always comes from land, right? I mean, that's just part of settler colonialism, that real wealth, genuine wealth, not upstart wealth, comes from land. And it goes back to political ideologues like Locke in the Second Treatise on privatization of land. America was the great place of where, and so this goes very deep, that real genuine wealth and traders and merchants who come and create New Amsterdam and Boston and so on, these are targets of suspicion because it's not real wealth. And there's this is just an inheritance, but that this is authentic. And in fact, in settler colonial countries all over the world, the capitals were always small towns because the big towns where the new inauthentic wealth was. So Pretoria and Ottawa and Canberra, but these were, it's very important, and it's just part of the culture. And these authenticities are very deep, very long-standing, involve collective memory, and simply can't be branded. And so it's just a different subject, but very much more deep in our contemporary American culture about Trump and everything else we've been witnessing.
Okay, we have a very short time for responses. Would you like to go first? Sure.
Okay, so thank you very much for your questions. To John, what I tried to do is to show that in every transparency there is a part of lie. So it's just it's really the question of the production, of the technical production of transparency. Transparency comes from optical field, so is really close to the to the technique since the beginning of the creation of this concept. So manufactured, artificial, but not in a moral or only moral sense. It's just like that, and we have to consider that. So Trump law is yes. I thought about your talk yesterday. Yes. So there is not a negative concept to the Trump-parency. It's not negative. It's just we have to talk of this articulation between transparency and artificiality. And for Aquila, finally, because it's the same question apparently. Yes, thank you very much. That's true. That's an important point. To become visible is not just negative. So unfortunately, the topic was Trump, so we don't have any positive to do. We went in the dystopic direction. But I think that is very important to become visible is also conquête, how do you say, victory, a social victory. And but the difference is important because for non-dystopic visibility, individuals need to be subject, and the visibility of Panopticon is not at all this kind of visibility. So it's more, we saw it in the Wendy talk, we are just product, we are market product in this new visibility of control.
So Jen, yes, that's why I was talking about branded authenticity and the ways in which that is fundamentally interactive and participatory. And so I like to think of authenticity and authentication as a palimpsest, right? Which takes these various historical things on top of each other. But I think the question of the branding is fundamentally a question of self-possession and identification. Leela, yes, and so my question has always been, to flip it slightly differently, how did networks which are so fundamentally public become private? Because if you think of how networks operate, we download each other's traffic all the time. So the idea that we think of our devices as personal, that's the perversity, right? So what if we took that fundamental publicness as a way in and refused this silly gesture of exposure, which can only happen because we believe in this public-private separation in terms of these networks which are fundamentally public, right? So it's more, it's trying to us to think through how did this public thing in which we're always exposed somehow get framed in a way that we're safe and not exposed. And what is the danger in that, and how does that link to this constant exposure of ourselves as exposed, which is actually the fundamental premise under which communication takes place. And what happens when we think about it that way and then engage with different modes of publicness and not. The question of settler colonialism is central. So Mukherjee actually argues that authenticity and the American obsession with authenticity is linked to settler colonialism. And I think that clearly there's a longer discussion to be made, especially since Trump was a slumlord, right? So if we're going to talk about real estate, I mean, there's a long history here to engage with. But I do think that that question of even reality and real estate, why is this real estate, is one that will be opened up in the next session.
Let's thank our speakers.